Yes, I'd like to welcome Cassia, Jakesta and Caitlynn Beckett, who have come all the way here from the Yukon Territories. But before I get into that, I'll just acknowledge that I'm zooming in today from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples in Canberra. And the seminar today is on Jaggerandurable country in beautiful Meanjin, just on the Brisbane River. So today we're delighted to be hosting a seminar called The Reclamation and Rematriation of Zizul, Ross River Cascadena's Story of the Faro Mine and the Development of Community-Based Revegetation Strategies. And our two presenters today have actually are in Australia because they've hosted a stream at the Society for Ecological Restoration Conference in Darwin, which was last week. And that conference, I've got the program here because I had the pleasure of being at that conference too last week. And that session was called Anti-Colonial Mine Site Reclamation, Restoration and Land Guardianship in Northern Canada. And I was involved in that stream with Kia Dowell. We were the only Australian sort of presenter in that. And there must have been, 15 people there from the Northwest Territories and Yukon, which was really fabulous. So just very briefly, Cassia Jakesta is a Laird First Nation member and the General Manager of Dina Cho Environmental and Remediation Inc. She has a degree in Natural Resource Science from Thompson Rivers University and is keenly interested in delivering environmental monitoring programs that support communities and community members. As part of her manager duties, Cassia leads the Faro Mine-based revegetation program. She brings a wealth of experience from a background working for both mining companies and the Cascadena. And Caitlynn, who you're seeing on your screen now, is a settler scholar of Norwegian, French and Scottish descent and is completing a PhD through Memorial University. She grew up on Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, Canada, and now lives in Whitehorse, Yukon. And Caitlynn has a research engagement agreement with and works for Ross River Dena Council and the Dena Cho Environmental and Remediation Inc. And her PhD focuses on the environmental justice implications of reclamation sites and anti-colonial strategies for healing contaminated places. So I'll hand over to you, Caitlynn, and I'll get off the screen and Julia Keenan will be managing questions after the presentation, which will last about 40 minutes. Then there'll be some question time. And I will just say those of you who are there in person might like to also join them for lunch afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Can everybody hear me? I'm not on mute, I don't think. Okay, perfect. I can't see myself oh, there we go. Okay. So as Sarah mentioned, my name's Caitlynn. Cassia is here in the audience today as well and will keep me in check and add in any content that I miss. So yeah, I'm gonna get started. Okay, that doesn't work. Nope. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I am a Kaskani, which is the Casco word for settler or non-Indigenous person. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm Norwegian, French, and Scottish descent, and I grew up in Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan. I'm doing my PhD at Memorial University, which is on the east coast of Canada in St. John's, Newfoundland, but I've lived and worked from Yukon for the past 4.5 years. Towards the ends of my master's degree with the Yellowknives Dene and the Northwest Territories, and through that research work, I made connections with Ross River community members and their research advisors who were interested in the research that we were doing in the NWT and asked if we would be interested in doing similar kind of work with the Ross River Dena Council. And so 6 years later, and hopefully finishing the PhD sometime soon, here we are. And for the past 4 years, as I mentioned, I've lived and worked as a guest on Tonquachan Council and Kwanlin Dun First Nations land in what is now called Whitehorse, Yukon. My research work and personal obligations are to the Ross River Cascadena and their unceded lands known as Denakaya. And this research was done in partnership with Ross River Dena, centered in Tulidlini, which is the name of the gathering spot at the meeting of two rivers. So this is also known as Ross River. And more specifically, this work is grounded in the Seizul region of Casca territory and works specifically with the land stewards of that region. And so I'd like to thank the elders from Blind Creek and Seizul that have directed this work, including Norman Steria, the late Grady Steria, Clifford McLeod, the Atkinson family, Louis Tommy, John Aklack, Nora Ledoux, and Dorothy John, and the many others who are not from that region but have contributed to this research. Specifically, I'd want to thank Elder Kathleen Souza, who's the Pharaoh Secretariat, and knows Pharaoh like the back of her hand. She always keeps me on my toes. And I also want to acknowledge Norman Baracello and Stu Van Bibber, whose work for Ross River and research mentorship has provided us with daily support and kindness. And finally, to Brittany Tufts, Jody Inkster, and Cassia Jakesta, who's here today, whose friendship and collaboration has really pulled all of this work together. Okay, just to get us situated, I'd like to use Elder Mary Maja's words as recorded and contextualized by Leanne Charlie and Joshua Baracello to introduce you very briefly to Tulalini and Denakaya. So Elder Mary Maja says, the territory of the Casca Nation spreads across so-called northern British Columbia, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. It's a land of mountain ranges and interconnected river systems. Wide river valleys are crisscrossed by trails deeply beaten down by the annual trek of caribou, moose, and wolves. The bones of this vast country carved by millennia of movement. Our country is big, says Elder Mary Maja. Before the settlers came here, our Dena tracks were all over this place. The Ross River Dena Council, or RRDC, is part of the Casca Nation and is located in Tulalini or Ross River, and RRDC represents the northern third of Casca territory in the eastern part of the Yukon. And so you can see here, this is a general kind of line around Casca territory, Northwest Territories, Yukon, and BC. And there are 5 Casca territory or Casca communities, sorry. Ross River is in the northern part here, and the Pharaoh mine and town of Pharaoh are located here. And then on the right-hand side, we have all of the 14 nations of the Yukon, also who have transboundary territories, obviously, into the Northwest Territories, Alaska, and British Columbia. It's important to note here that Ross River has not signed a land claim agreement. And in the Yukon, we have what's called the Umbrella Final Agreement that was signed in the 1990s. And that outlines how each nation goes through the land claim process. So it's kind of, yeah, an umbrella or structure for that. Ross River has resisted, Casca more broadly have resisted that structure and have decided not to sign a land claim. So their territory is what we call in Canada is unceded. And they have a direct relationship with the federal government through the Indian Act and don't have a land claim agreement. And so before I get into the meat of things as well, I just wanted to note that the information presented on the following slides has been reviewed by elders, leadership, research advisors, and co-authors, but it's not yet been finalized or signed off on by Chief and Council. So please don't take any screenshots or quotes, except for Cassia, who's doing it right now. She's allowed to. Okay. Good timing. Okay, so I'm just going to do a bit of an overview for my PhD, the theoretical and methodological grounding of the work. And so grounded in this particular place, Seizul and Tulalini, and in these relationships, I draw on literature from a variety of disciplines and practices to help shape my own reflexivity as a settler, to direct my analysis of extractivism and colonial structures, and to ground myself in strategies for Indigenous environmental justice and anti-colonial research practice. I draw from work in political ecology, Northern research geographies, discard studies, Indigenous methodologies, place-based research, and environmental justice. And here I'd like to place and problematize the concept of reclamation within this literature. I'm going to use the term reclamation because that's what's generally used in Northern Canada. And I also use the term remediation because that's what is specifically refers to the containment of mining waste. But at Pharaoh, as other mine sites, there's a much broader discussion of reclamation, which includes revegetation, restoration of environment, alternative uses of space, and remediation of contaminated materials. So The spectacle of reclamation. In Tara Jolly and the Fort McMurray Métis research work on oil sand reclamation, they critique what they call the spectacle of reclamation, a performative and paternalistic phenomenon where companies tour community members and regulators around reclamation areas, carefully curating what reclamation can look like and how it can be engaged with. Most importantly, the spectacle is used to legitimate or absolve extractivism. How could anyone protest extraction if landscapes will be returned to an ecologically stable state and we will all get rich in the process? Within political ecology and environmental philosophy, the notion that restoration can actually achieve some kind of pre-industrial environment has been debunked and challenged for years. Most importantly, research scholarship from Jennifer Grenz, a Nicapalmuk scholar at the University of British Columbia, brings together the work of countless other Indigenous ecologists and theorists and argues that common approaches to ecological restoration are rooted in colonial concepts of nature, including native versus non-native dichotomies and constructs of pre-human naturalness that disregard the purposeful stewarding and shaping of the lands and waters by Indigenous people. Grenz terms these Eden-based ecological restoration goals. And despite widespread reclamation critique in academia, on the ground and in the mining industry, reclamation, remediation, restoration, or whatever term you might use in different locations, is constantly framed as making better or returning to a pre-industry state. Building on Gren's notion of Eden-based ecological restoration, this articulation of mine reclamation as a spectacle of good gestures towards an absolving of sins, innocence, and saviorism, obscuring the theft and violence that is often at the core of many mining operations, while also transforming post-mining lands into carefully managed colonial places of waste storage that are always open for further extraction and carefully monitored within the bounds of Western science. Instead of falling into the trap of reclamation spectacle, I want to draw on literatures that point to the continuation of extractivism in and through reclamation. And I argue that this is done in two ways. First, through rendering reclamation technical, and second, through the perpetuation of accumulation through dispossession. And I'll explain this a bit. Reclamation knowledge and practices are often rendered technical within fields such as engineering, hydrology, and ecology. Reclamation expertise excludes community understandings of environmental violence, contamination, and day-to-day relationality with land, obscuring not only the environmental and economic and cultural impacts of extraction, but also the impacts of reclamation itself. In addition, the community labor and resources that must go into reclaiming land, cultural practices, governance structures, and more than human relationships is not articulated or supported in mainstream reclamation discourses. Rendering reclamation as technical is a strategic and structural move to ensure continued settler state control of extracted lands. Reclamation does not mean that land is given back or that lost land and relationships are compensated for. Human and more than human lives lost because of extractive colonialism are not accounted for in the ledger sheets of remediation projects. In addition, reclamation projects themselves are extractive even after ore stops moving from the site. Large reclamation projects are worth millions or even billions of dollars in contracts. In almost all cases, the majority of benefits from these contracts have, in Canada, we say flown south, or in other words, do not land in the pockets of Indigenous communities most impacted by both past mining development and the success or failure of future reclamation. In a sense, accumulation by dispossession perpetuates itself as the wastes of past mining projects become contracting commodities. Okay, and so then how do we respond to these critiques of reclamation in a practical way? Framing discussions on toxic mine waste and reclamation within an environmental justice framework brings community concerns and impacts to the center of the discussion. Indigenous environmental justice situates mining waste and the science of this waste as both material and social, and argues that we must confront both the materialities of waste and the colonial, gendered, and racialized systems within which waste is understood, produced, and distributed. Scholars such as Eve Tuck, Sarah Hunt, Sarah DeLeo, and Dana Powell emphasize the need to avoid and go beyond a focus on ruin, loss, and damage. In this sense, reclamation as a perpetual care practice focuses attention on the process of healing and resistance rather than on the damage done in the past, while still holding space for the documentation of these injustices. In this context, reclamation of cultural practices goes hand in hand with the remediation of contamination and the resurgence of land, language, and sacred sites. Grounded in the ideas of care and healing as articulated by these scholars, this research work aims to resist the spectacle of reclamation and to dig into the complex relationality of reclaiming and healing landscapes and communities, moving beyond engineering containment solutions towards confronting questions about justice and self-determination. Okay, and so to do this research takes a community and place-based research approach. Otherwise, I guess the acronym is Participatory Action Research, or PAR, focuses on working with communities in a way that decenters the investigator, emphasizes the co-production of knowledge, centers social justice, and employs a methodological focus on process rather than outcomes or results. And so in this context, research agendas are determined collectively and grow out of specific local contexts, struggles for justice, and ongoing community projects. And in doing so, participatory action research purports to attend to the power relations between researchers, institutions, and communities. However, several Canadian and North American scholars, including Sarah DeLeo, Hunt and Greenwood, Coombs, Johnson, and Howitt, highlight important challenges or pitfalls of community-based research. And I briefly mention them here as points of reflection, discussion, and direction for this research. So these scholars caution against a focus on pain narratives. They also point to a problematic emotional attachment to doing good, or assuming that action research is always the best option, without leaving space for dissent, dissatisfaction, refusal, and other research methods. The final concern expressed of these scholars is that the university often remains the central producer or gatekeeper of knowledge. In response to some of these concerns, Tuck and McKenzie point to place-based or nation-based research as a process that centers sovereignty and self-determination while making space for contention and conflict. Place-based research is centered in continual reflections on how partners collaborate and how these collaborations may need to change over the time and contexts, ensuring Indigenous community control of research rather than vague references to co-production of knowledge, research agreements that outline expectations for reciprocity and accountability, and research that is process-based and focus on long-term contributions rather than immediate outputs. And so for reclamation specifically, framed within an Indigenous environmental justice approach, Indigenous Yaqui legal scholar Rebecca Sosi calls for place-based ethics of remediation, which seeks to heal degraded land through the integration of local values, restorative justice, and self-determination for Indigenous communities. Okay, and then so at Barrow specifically, just checking what time it is. I'll just go through really quickly how this has looked for my research and work with Dana Cho. And so in early 2019, I submitted a draft research plan and ethics application to Ross River Dena Council that was based on conversations with their research advisors. We then met with Chief Counsel and Ross River staff in May 2019 to hone in on research priorities and questions and review Casca protocols for data ownership. So all of the data collected in this project is owned by Ross River Dena Council. We then held an elders workshop in June 2019 to get further feedback and direction on research priorities and questions, and to ensure that these plans fit within Casca protocols for knowledge sharing. At this workshop, we solidified several research priorities, which I'll outline on the next slide, and also obligations and responsibilities. And a part of the obligations and responsibilities has also been my employment with Dana Cho. So Chief and Counsel and the research advisors asked if I would work for Dana Cho as a part of research reciprocity, because Dena Council wanted the on-the-ground support for reclamation work, writing, project management, and grant applications. And they also wanted to support me financially for extended community-based research that would most likely go beyond the 4 years of funding I had for my PhD. And I like to include this quote from Clifford, who always tells me that I work for him and not for the university. Yeah, he's saucy. Okay. And so then this is how we came to these research priorities. And I just like to include a quote here from Norman Steria, which is that he wanted a repatriation plan. And then Elder Mary Maja, who's in this picture below, corrected him and said a rematriation plan, a sovereignty plan. And what is the definition of reclamation anyway? And Norman here stresses that after it's cleaned up, he wants it back. And that is an important part of what reclamation is in that Casca context. And so the priorities that elders identified was a desire to tell Ross River's story of Pharaoh and the Tsezul area, a desire for community-directed assessment, impact assessment of Pharaoh, a structural analysis of the remediation planning, so all of the documentation, the technical work that is currently happening for Pharaoh is really overwhelming, and they wanted to get a handle on that. They wanted to identify how ensuring safety and healing for Tsezul's vegetation and wildlife could become a priority. And they also wanted to teach me how to play hand games. So I've definitely learned the last one. The other four we'll see. And then we decided to focus on this as a process of research questioning. And so rather than having set research questions. In the context of place-based research, we didn't necessarily have clear research questions. And as my friend Jared reminded me a while back, as I was freaking out how to fit this into like that classic academic structure, he said that place-based research is specifically nonlinear, leaving space for different kinds of questioning and responses as context and need desire. It also leaves space for questioning the intent of research itself. Okay, and so those are the questioning kind of framework that we went forward with. So how do we tell Ross River's story of Pharaoh? How is that contaminated land created, conceptualized, and maintained in a theoretical sense? And how is reclamation governed and defined in the Yukon and at Pharaoh? And then the last question is some kind of more practical approach that we took for revegetation is how do we frame reclamation within Casca protocols? This is a really brief kind of structure of my PhD, but it shows how those outcomes and questioning, how we followed up on that. So the first two chapters and the community report are really focused on telling that story of Tsezul. The first two chapters are archival based and point to the structures, government structures that resulted in the contamination and theft of land and water at Tsezul. And the third section there is a community authored paper that is based in quotes and stories from elders. I won't go into part 2 today because I'm not done writing it. And part 3, we're going to focus on the revegetation work that Cassia and I have been doing. Okay, so I just want to quickly introduce everybody more specifically to Tsezul and the Pharaoh mine. And so you'll see here a quote from Louis is that Blind Creek, which is a creek that runs through the Tsezul region, was a good haven for us. It was a very important place for the salmon run. It's one of the longest salmon runs in North America. And it was also a family gathering space. And so that's a really important area that's actually outside of the mine footprint, but that people were pushed away of because of mostly the town site there. And just as a bit of context for mining in the Yukon, most people know the Yukon through the Klondike Gold Rush, which happened in 1898. The Yukon was actually created as a territory because of the Klondike Gold Rush. So mining is very embedded in the history of the place as a settler colonial jurisdiction. Residential schools were constructed from the 1900s until the 1960s. There were multiple residential schools constructed around the same time that exploration for major mining was happening in the 40s and 50s, and that is not a coincidence. At the same time as all that is happening, we also have a lot of road to resources programs in the Yukon for the 1940s and 60s alongside the Second World War and the rush for large-scale industrial mining. The Klondike Gold Rush was placer mining, so kind of a different context there. And in 1973, the 14 Yukon First Nations chiefs came together and produced a document called Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And this initiated the land claims process, negotiations process in the Yukon, and Ross River was a part of that process. As I said, an umbrella final agreement for land claims wasn't signed until the 1990s, so it was a very long negotiation. As all of that is happening, the Faro mine was constructed in 1969, opened in 1969. It's a lead zinc mine. Today, there are 70 million tons of tailings and 320 million tons of waste rock. It was abandoned in 1999. The major issue on the site is extensive acid rock drainage, and it is not actually in reclamation at this moment. It's been in remediation planning and impact assessment since the early 2000s. So it has been a care and maintenance site for over 20 years. Okay. And so the first two chapters of my PhD and kind of answering the call for Ross River's story of Sezoul is focused on archival research as directed by interviews with elders. So elders would kind of point out like what they thought was important about the history of Faro. And then I use that information to go into Yukon and federal archives to pull out the structural kind of narratives of how land is stolen and how water was stolen and how that was legitimated through regulatory processes. And so we call this attempts or infrastructures of theft. And we use the word theft because elders thought that it implied more responsibility than a term like dispossession and accountability. And we also use the word attempts because as elders wanted to emphasize is that this land has not been fully stolen, neither have the waters, and that they are still monitored and stewarded by Casca people. So following Pasternak and King's call for an understanding, detailing, and dismantling of infrastructures of theft, as I said, we use archival documents to pinpoint the key mechanisms that governments and companies used and continue to use to dispossess Casca land. And the archival research here does not serve as like a validation for elders' stories, hence why these chapters are separate in my research, but rather points to responsibility, the responsibility of government, regulators, and mining companies for harm and violence in the past. And I also want to note that Brittany Tufts and I have reviewed this material with Elders Council and discussed the challenges of sharing some of these painful memories in recognition of avoiding pain narratives. And so the themes and quotes that you see here have been approved for sharing as a part of the broader process of reclaiming and centering Ross River's story of Faro. Okay, and so the Van Gorda and Faro mineral claims were staked in the 1950s and 60s. Van Gorda is just another kind of mine area on the broader Faro site. But Casca families have known about these ore showings for generations. Casca men from the Steria, Ledoux, and John families showed settler prospectors these areas and were sometimes paid for their assistance, but they were not able to stake claims for themselves, as this required registration in Whitehorse, and this was a time when there's no roads or vehicles in the Yukon. Between 1964 and 65, over 11,000 claims were staked in Ross River's territory, and many of these claims are still maintained to this day. Advanced exploration and development of Faro Mine and the construction of the town site began in the mid-1960s. And in 1968, the Yukon and Canadian governments signed the Anvil Agreement for the Cypress Anvil Mine. It's now called Faro. Names change. This agreement gave free land to the company to develop both the mine and the town without any treaty or land claim negotiations. And Ross River would later go on to fight this in court in the early 2000s. Yukon government and the federal government then paid over $100 million 1960s dollars to construct roads, a port, don't know what that is, sorry, to construct roads, a port, communication networks, and eventually a dam that would power much of the Yukon. The feds also assisted with the costs for the construction of the town of Faro, which displaced Ross River families from Blind Creek. So once the mine was constructed, the Yukon government in Canada continually permitted the expansion of tailings ponds, despite several dam failures and waste rock piles scattered throughout the valley. When talking about land theft, most Ross River elders refer to the broken promises that early prospectors and mine developers made. Because of these broken promises and stolen land, the Faro mine is cursed. Following the story, as told by Grady Steria, John Aklak, and Gordon Peter, Faro has been cursed since Al Kulan, the white settler who staked a claim in the Faro area in the 1950s, deceived the Ross River Casca families who had housed him. The arches of this curse include the Faro Fire in 1969, which burnt down the newly constructed town, the untimely and dramatic deaths of the 3 men involved in the discovery and development of the Faro mine, the many tailing spills and dam failures that have happened since, the continual strikes and shutdowns, and today the ongoing inability of the project to move forward. The Faro mine continues to be cursed, and project coordinators today call it the Faro factor. And this curse is linked to the resistance of Casca land itself. As Robbie Dick points out in this quote at the bottom, I think it's because of the injustice that took place upon our land, and it was our land showing what they did was wrong. After the initial dispossession or theft of land via mining permits and town construction, the maintenance of settler state power came through the water licensing process. Faro produced, on average, 3 million tons of tailings annually and dumped these tailings into the river valley at first without water treatment facilities. Regulation through the Water Board did 2 things. It legitimated and made space for the contamination of Ross River waters without their consent or governance. And we recorded several major spills and dam failures in records throughout the 70s and 80s, and charges were only laid twice and amounted to $5,000. Water regulation also separated water rights for mining companies from ongoing land claim negotiations, signing away water rights for mining companies, while the same land and water rights and self-governance were being negotiated at another table. In the face of this marginalization, Ross River still continues to use the Water Board public platform to fight for their land rights and to express their concerns. And I'll show some examples of that in a couple of slides. And these are a couple of quotes from elders talking about their concern about mine effluent pouring into many water courses, creeks, and streams, and that water is the most precious thing on earth besides air. Okay, economic theft. Several elders speak about working in the early days of the mine as line cutters and laborers, but that they quickly lost their jobs as the mine expanded and recruited settlers from the south to live in Faro. Elders' memories of job discrimination are reflected in employment records. So the Anvil Agreement stated that once the mine entered the production stage, Anvil would make a bona fide effort to employ 25% local Indigenous people. However, with no legal consequences for breaking this agreement, the Anvil Agreement did not lead to successful establishment of an Indigenous workforce at the mine of any kind, or any kind of community benefit structure, such as profit sharing. And there was successive agreements with different companies that purchased the mine later. There was never any kind of profit sharing agreement. Ross River members were also marginalized from jobs and economic opportunities, specifically because of housing. The company and government were in charge of housing rentals, and their own records detail exclusion of Ross River members from company housing. Structural economic theft includes millions of dollars also invested by the federal government, territorial government, or the various mining companies that went to community members in Faro, but not to Ross River members itself. So if you look at the net profits of the mine over the decades of operation, which is about $500 million in 2022 dollars, Ross River received no royalties, while the territorial and federal government received an estimated $91 million in 2022 dollars. In addition, Faro has a lot more services. It has paved roads, it has a pool, like these types of things that were introduced. Ross River is about 70 kilometers down the road from Faro. This is a story from Louis, who did get a job at the mine in the early days and talked about trying to get a house and saying that he had a wife and a young child, and they were staying down by the river in tent frames. He explains that he was told he had to wait a month to get housing, and then he saw other non-Indigenous people working for shorter amounts of time and getting housing, and he continued to not be able to get a house, and so he took off his hard hat, threw it on the table, and quit. And he never did go back. Okay, and finally, just to come back to the cultural theft, which I alluded to a little bit at the beginning, throughout the same time the Pharaoh was being constructed, they have the construction and expansion of residential schools across the north. So in the rest of Canada, in the south, residential schools started to be closed at this time, but in the north, they were actually being constructed. There was also the relocation of the community of Tulalini from one side of the river to the other, and this was a forced relocation by the federal government. There was extractive violence, specifically gendered violence towards women in the community. And then there's, as I mentioned, the inequity in settler states controlled services. So most of the services offered in Ross River were offered temporarily. Buildings were constructed as temporary structures to support mining exploration, and then permanent structures were constructed in the town of Faro. And to this day, the road to Ross River remains unpaved. Okay. And here's some quotes from elders talking about living in Blind Creek and then being taken away for residential schools. And a lot of elders don't have a lot of memories of Blind Creek or the Tsezul area because of being taken for residential schools. So both residential schools and mining were a source of cultural dispossession. So in response to this theft in the 80s and 90s, Ross River Denna Council produced substantial evidence of the impacts and challenges they were facing due to the Faro mine. These reports outline the need for local control over resource governance, the lack of work opportunities, and the inequity in resource wealth distribution. They also included lists of expectations for future economic development and guidance for land planning. Ross River members also resisted theft on the ground. So this newspaper article, which was shared with me by Dorothy John, tells the story of the John family who resisted the construction of the Faro golf course on their traditional territories. They planted stakes and maintained cabins on the proposed golf course grounds throughout 1985. Other examples of Ross River's resistance throughout the 70s and 80s and onward is their active involvement in different regulatory processes and their resistance of that regulatory process. So in the 1980s, some of their demands of the Water Licensing Board included a more robust monitoring program that would include Ross River people, that the tailings impoundment system would be designed in a way that minimized the potential for tailings oxidation, including the use of a special liner to reduce seepage and groundwater contamination, an ongoing evaluation of geochemical and groundwater regimes. They wanted a full financial security. And they also wanted a requirement for an ongoing negotiation procedure between Cypress Anvil and the Council for Yukon Indians for the identification of jobs, training, and other benefits for their communities. These demands were ignored by the Water Board, and any calls for rights were deemed out of scope of the authority of the Water Board as land claims negotiations were ongoing. And some additional examples of resistance are found in these quotes from Councillor George Smith at a water board hearing, where he says, "Our concern for well-being of the land, its animals, and the water and the fish is not only based on spiritual and cultural beliefs, but also on economics. So the alienation of these lands from subsistence use has never been compensated for the Ross River Indian people." And he also emphasized in 1987 that the band says its consent should be sought for mining activity in the area. So I think this is really important to note, is that these histories of resistance have been ongoing since the beginning of the mine, and that these same things keep coming up now in the reclamation and the impact assessment of that remediation project. And so a lot of folks get a bit disillusioned when they see that they've been saying these same things over and over and over again for decades, and they haven't been dealt with. And so this is just a picture to emphasize that continuation of racism and marginalization. This is a picture that the Ross River Lands Office put up called Tsezul. So it was an explanation of the history of that area and also directions for a new hunting permitting system that Ross River is trying to implement in the area because of overhunting of moose, especially because of access roads for mining. People can get into that area more easily to hunt. And within the day of it being put up, it was vandalized. And I think this just really goes to show the kind of continuation of racism and marginalization that happens in this space, and how that's wrapped up in reclamation and this notion of looking back. Reclamation is always the project team members always want to look forward, acknowledging the history, but they don't really see how that history is perpetuated through ongoing actions. Okay, and so I'll just, I'm taking up too much time, zip through here our revegetation program, and Cassia can add anything that she likes, and we can also have more discussion time about it. But I wanted to end on kind of some of the super fun and exciting work that we've been doing to begin imagining reclamation alternatives that are grounded in Casca knowledge, language, ethics, and legal structures. And this is, it's Guzeni, and this was designed by Elder Dennis Shorty, who's also an artist in Ross River. And so these imaginings come to life through collaboratively written reflections on I guess now it's 3 years of work with Casca elders and youth on community-based revegetation strategy for Faro. And so when we were reviewing a lot of the technical documents for the Faro remediation project through my work for Dena Cho, Jody, Stu, who is our manager, Cassia, and I flagged that wildlife and plants are a particular area of concern, and that are not being focused on in the same way as water treatment or covers management, that type of thing. Still very important, but elders wanted to see how water treatment and covers ended in health for wildlife and plants. And so we also focused on the following priorities: employment opportunities for youth, reclaiming physical space for the Casca community on the Faro site, which is a very hard site to access, grounding revegetation and wildlife work in Casca protocols, gathering information about plant and wildlife health and safety, and by extension, moving towards projects that are centered around community health that includes plant, wildlife, and people. And so we also work so that this aligns with Ross River's land guardianship program, which is similar to rangers in Australia. Okay, and so this is an ongoing project that prioritizes the reclaiming of relationships with Sezul alongside the strategic use of Western science tools to ensure the future safety of plants, animals, and community. Okay, these are Cassia's slides, so I can't take credits for the photos. But we have hired 13 youth and 6 elders in 2021, 9 youth and 4 elders in 2022, and 11 youth and 6 elders this past summer. The first year we planted Tsut, which is white spruce, Gonze, which is lodgepole pine, and in the second year we introduced Choba, which is trembling aspen, and we planted those same ones this year. The Faro revegetation program, I think these are all pictures from 2023. Yeah. Planting, so on the left, planting on the slopes of the landform cover and revegetation pilot. And so you can see the scope of the mine in that picture quite well. It's a very difficult area to plant in. It's very rocky and it's windy and hot and there's a lot of dust. And then we also planted this year 7 different species of what we, I guess, call boutique species. But these are plants that we've started collecting seed from in the Casca area and then sent to a nursery. And then they're actually getting planted so that we're using Casca land, seed, and plants, and expanding the types of plants that we can use. And these are planting mounds at the trial, so trying different types of cover systems and different types of planting to see what works. As I mentioned, we have the seed collection program. So Casca elders have told us the importance of collecting seed for revegetation from local areas. And this is also an ideal way to engage the community and to make sure people get paid. It's also much nicer because we're not on the mine site and we get to go to really beautiful areas. And we get to pick berries alongside of it too. We have a lot of elder involvement in this program. So we have elders, Mary, Maja, and Nora Ledoux on the left there picking seed. And then elders Teresa and Teresa and Annie. Ooh, forgetting names. Teresa Robinson and Annie Ledoux planting trees this past year. We also have a vegetation sampling program. So we had a lot of concerns from elders about heavy metal contamination in plants. And so they didn't want to start replanting or planting the area until we can show that those plants that will be planted at Faro will actually be safe and will be safe for animals to eat as well. So we have now a vegetation sampling program that maybe we're going to expand into tissue sampling of animals as well. And this program focuses on collecting vegetation samples and analyzing the metals content in different plant tissues using washed and unwashed samples in different parts of the plant. We also have asked that the lab do different preparations. So for example, making tea with specific species. So they sample the tea and that's just to look at how these plants are actually used by people. These are all the areas that we sampled in 2022, and we went back to most of these areas. And so you can see Ross River there, Faro, and then these are other road access areas that we used and do a lot of driving. And preliminary analysis of the sampling program has showed that lead is the primary metal of interest, which we knew. That's not a surprise. But what we've been working on is trying to characterize the extent of that contamination, and then also looking at how well cover treatment systems are reducing that lead content. If the lead is coming up through water and roots, or if it's mostly from dust deposition from the surrounding tailings. And this is a picture of the site that had the highest lead content levels, called Burrow 8. Oh yeah, the tailings are in the background. That is a small portion of the tailings. The tailings you can't see the end of from one valley from one end of the valley to the other. So some highlights of this program: we've planted 88,000 trees. This year we planted the local seeds, the native seeds from Cassia, boutique species. It's so funny. Which include yellow mountain avens, low bush cranberry, bare root, and crowberry. And yeah, so we're planting now 7 different species, and we collected a lot of seed this year to plant for future programs. And I just want to end with a couple of quotes from elders. So Gordon Peter said that they were talking about planting different plants and trees and whatever, and he emphasized that Ross River people can do that and keep them at their word to do this. So that's what we've been trying to do is keep the government accountable for actually doing some of this work, because sometimes there's a lot of talk and actually making it happen. The logistics of making it happen is probably the biggest part of the work. And so, and I'll end with Dennis Shorty's quote here, which I think is really beautiful. But when you put the plant in, you got to treat it as a relative. You got to talk to it. It gives us life. And that's how we breathe, air through the plants. They are part of us, a part of Mother Earth. So we got to treat them with respect. Every plant you put in there, that's our relations. And so in reflection of that, every time we start a planting program or do seed collection in different areas, we start with a prayer and an offering and thanks to the plants that will be helping us to heal Zazul. And to conclude, I'll just come back to that idea of an ethic of reclamation with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's very famous. How we approach restoration of lands depends, of course, on what we believe that land means. And so restoring land for production of natural resources is not the same as renewal of land as cultural identity. And we have to think about what land means in the context in which we're doing reclamation. All right, so Gesunda, only 10 minutes over.
Okay, thank you so much. That was super interesting, and we have a few minutes left for questions. So anyone in the room? I'll see if there's anything online. Oh, sorry.
If no one in the room has any questions, I've got a question.
Okay, go for it, Sarah.
You in the title for the for your seminar, Caitlynn and Cassia, you mentioned this concept of rematriation, and I've discussed this a little bit with you before. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that concept, because it's a bit of a new one for Australia, but it seems to me that there's a lot of resonances too with some of the work that we do here in reclaiming and reimagining mine sites as well. So can you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on that idea or concept of rematriation?
Sure. So I'll just go back to the quote from Norman Steria, and Norman is a really important elder for the Sazal area. So Norman used the word repatriation, and then he was quickly corrected by Mary and other women elders in the community saying rematriation. And in that specific context, I've been told that it's because Casca Dena are a matrilineal society, and so yeah, it would be rematriation. And I think in the broader context of the use of that term in Canada, I'm blanking right now on who said this. It was just recently, so I'll have to think about where I heard this from, but it's not my idea. Is that repatriation? Oh, sorry, it was actually at a presentation that was at the SER conference in Darwin, but there was a Cree presenter, not Cree, Blood Tribe, Dakota presenter presenting on the rematriation of bison in the Southern Plains in Alberta. And he said that repatriation refers for them to the giving back or repatriation of an object, a thing, whereas rematriation is directly connected to land and relationships. And so I think that that is a really interesting and provocative way of thinking about the difference of those things. In addition to repatriation just being also connected to a very paternalistic colonial Western way of thinking about ownership, and rematriation as a kind of subversive reaction to that overall way of thinking.
Thanks, Caitlynn.
Nick.
Thank you. I like this idea of rematriation as well. That's the first time I've ever heard of it. Just makes me think, because I work with matrilineal societies in Papua New Guinea and mining villages, so it's giving you something to think about there. More comment than question. So I really like the way you use this term theft. So playing with the ideas around accumulation by dispossession, I think framing it around theft, there's a directness to that, and I like the way in which you've emphasised that points towards accountability or responsibility in ways that perhaps scholarly terms like dispossession or Harvey's idea of accumulation by dispossession kind of loses that in a way. But the rub of it is that dispossession requires someone to do the taking, typically without permission. So I think there's a bluntness to it that I think works really well there. The other comment I had was the way in which you're framing the work on the land, or the regeneration work on the land as being technical, the way in which it's rendered technical, and I like that, because Tanya Murray Lee's work on that I think is very helpful to think through. But it also made me immediately think, well, isn't this also a kind of anti-politics machine to this work in this form it functions in that same way, because it gets people thinking about the technical, forces the attention around the technical aspects of regenerative work, kind of masking over the politics and the history, kind of the real politics of what's going on here with the people's connection to land and what they want from land. So just other ways of thinking about it. But yeah, otherwise, this is really interesting. And I think as a PhD project, I understand that, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's just very ambitious and very impressive, particularly the way in which you're doing it.
Thanks, Cassia.
And I know you don't use the word collaboration, but the very collaborative dimension to it. Very impressive.
Thank you.
Not something we see in a lot of PhD projects.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll
Oh,
just sorry, I can just
No.
respond to that is for a long time I was using the word dispossession. And with Brittany Tufts, she's a Ross River Dena. She's also just finished her master's, and so we've been working together on a lot of this stuff. So I want to make sure I give her credit. But we were just reviewing through all of this in the spring with the Elders Council, and they specifically said that they wanted to change the word. And so I just want to point that out there, that for them it was dispossession is an academic term, theft is a lot more understandable, and they specifically said that it puts a face behind the theft. And so those first two chapters are really at like the paper trail of how theft happens, and how the colonial governments, both the Yukon government and the federal government and the mining company, but more so focused on the government and the regulatory. And that's where I think it connects to that. The anti-political aspect that you were talking about is that the regulatory systems are used to render things technical. And as soon as you say, well, a discussion of rights, a discussion of community compensation in this case, those are not within the scope of water regulation. Those are not within the scope of impact assessment. And so then those things are always put outside of those boxes, even though those boxes include community engagement. And so I think that with Ross, I think they're just so frustrated with having to try to work in those boxes, even after resisting those boxes for so long, that's how we got to the revegetation. Is just like, what can we do? What can we actually just do to like get something done that's community directed? Because these regulatory systems take decades to resist, and to go through the legal processes of doing that. So for example, Ross, in 2012, I believe, had a court case where they said Faro was illegally developed, at least for 3 years before negotiations started in 1973. They're still in the process of negotiating what compensation would look like for that illegal development. And so in the process, elders who were directly impacted by that have passed away. And so I think, part of the revegetation is just like, what can we do? So thank you for those comments.
We've got time.
We started a bit late, so.
Yeah, my questions were about the governance and how this happens, and what are the structures. And you just mentioned some of them actually, but presumably, you're planning where the ecologists have determined you need to be planting. So what do those structures look like, and how do you ensure that they're not going to reproduce the same sort of claim as possession or things that you mentioned that the mine brought in the first place? And there's obviously avenues that you're using to get in there. So I was just interested in those, that side of it.
Yeah, that's a fun one, because you can add on if you want. We have a direct partnership with a company called Integral Ecology Group. They're the company. This is a $1 billion reclamation program. So like there's like so many layers of consulting companies that you have to work through and resist and work against and figure out the whole like process of how you make that happen. And so I think that the logistics of actually doing that is the anti-colonial work of like the paperwork of just making sure these things happen, and learning where to like resist and push, and learning where you just gotta like accept that whatever these massive companies are not going to budge. But working with IEG has been really fantastic. They're a small company that's on board to do this type of work, and they've really pushed for us, and they have more capacity, more staff to help push to get some of this work done. And they are also very respectful of learning languages, following Casca protocols, making sure that that comes before the Western science. And so I think in that sense, just having a partner in the kind of Western science field, in addition to like Cassia and I are both trained in like Western sciences as well. I'm not a scientist, I'm a social scientist, whatever that means. Yeah. But so I think having a really interdisciplinary group, Jody Inkster, who she's in this picture here, but she helped start the program as well. She's from Ross. She's also trained as a Western scientist. And so I think like, you know, for Cassia and Jody, like just being able to straddle those worlds is a lot of work and really impressive. And I think that's what gets it done. So yeah.
And then we also just try to like include elders with some of the, you know, with what they are concerned about. We really want to include their input in all of it that we do.
Yeah. And so we also like pay elders, like not just honorary, we pay them as staff. We pay the tree planters not per tree, which is like standard industry. We pay them like hourly, recognizing that like some days they can't show up in the same way, but wanting to offer people just a stable space to be in where they don't have to like follow the expectations of some massive consulting company. So
just for that example, paying elders, is the source of that money part of the $2 billion?
Yeah.
That is controlled by the ecological firm?
It's controlled by the federal government. So this is a abandoned site. So it's a federal project. And so a lot of that has been building relationships with the federal staff in order to funnel more money into Denicho. So Denicho has a partnership with IEG, which is controlled by a larger company, SRK, which I'm sure works in Australia. They have the full contract for the design, or AECOM somewhere in there. There's like a whole thing. But honestly, it has been working a lot with the federal government to funnel money through, funnel increasingly more amounts of money through these incredibly convoluted systems. Yeah.
It sounds like it'll work in that.
Yeah.
Just was checking the chat just one more time to
Oh
make
yeah,
sure we
if anyone
have anyone
online has questions, post them in the chat, or could probably just talk and unmute themselves too.
Anyone else? Nick, you can go again. Take the microphone though.
But at the risk of throwing more concepts into the mix, which I'm going to do anyway. So because you're thinking through an abandoned mine landscape, we had a PhD student here who was doing the same with Papua New Guinea, and he landed on the idea of what we call a mining residuum, or a residual landscape, which may be useful for thinking through this here as well, because it's essentially emphasizing that what's left after a mine is abandoned, and it plays on a mining term, which is a residuum, what's kind of left after kind of stealing things down, but it captures the ambiguities that are left in that abandoned landscape, but also the sedimented layers of all of that history, and that's unresolved as well. So this was some of the thinking we were doing around abandoned landscapes, and you can share the paper with it. It's useful.
Yeah,
because it's I think it's good to think through how do we theorize these landscapes.
Yeah, I really like that. I'd love to learn more or share that work. And I think in this context, we've started using the ideas of healing, or like care, like perpetual care, which is an ongoing thing that doesn't necessarily have an end, and specifically in the Casca context of guardianship. And so that also is strategic to link to different funding opportunities, but at the same time that these spaces will need guardians in the way that Casca have stewarded that space for thousands of years. And so what would guardianship look like in the specific context of a very contaminated site? FAIR will also require water treatment in perpetuity. So there's no notion of ever walking away at that site. So yeah. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Takers online. Okay, well, thank you everyone, and thank you, Cassia.
Oh yeah,
And
Cassia,
thank-
do you have anything you wanna?
Can they hear me?
Take them on.
Hello?
It's working, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that, Cascadena people have a very strong relationship to the land. It's not really something that you can describe. It's just like this connection that it's like I guess a spiritual connection. And the tree planting and seed collection programs have brought back the connection to an area that we didn't think was possible. And we've been able to include elders that would have never gone back. And so I think in some small way, we're helping them. And yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to come to Australia. It's a completely different world. I've learned a lot about Indigenous peoples here, and we have a lot of similarities. And yeah, we're not all about pain, but we're also about healing and moving forward and seeing where things can be governed in a more respectful way. And that was all that I wanted to say.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Perfect way to end. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.
Thanks online.
Thanks.